funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.
Perhaps no person in Irish history is so loved by one community on the island of Ireland and loathed by the other as Edward Carson, the preeminent Irish Unionist leader from 1910 to 1921. To countless Irish nationalists, he's detested as the man who divided Ireland. Conversely, to countless Ulster Unionists, he's the hero who helped save them from Dublin rule. Or to use a biblical metaphor, he's the Moses who led them to the promised land. Here's Belfast Unionist Billy Dixon talking about the window above Carson's final resting place in St Anne's Cathedral in Belfast.
Over his resting place in St Anne's Cathedral, there's a stained glass window of Moses, and Moses was a leader of the people, leading them to the promised land. He didn't enter the promised land, but he led them to the promised land. And Carson was the leader to show us the way. He achieved a Northern Ireland.
Edward Carson, a lot of people say he's the hero of unionism. His survival in folk memory is almost exclusively through the Orange Order. If anybody, a young person or adult now, has a connection to Edward Carson, it's in the marching season and the banners, because that's where you will see his face time and time and time again.
Jonathan Gray of the Kaleeshal and Clonanese Historical Society, based in County Tyrone.
Obviously, there's a statue up at Stormont with a famous finger. And there's all sorts of jokes and things that go on about that, certainly from Republican politics and everything like that.
And to discover more about the Carson statue, I visited Stormont Estate in Belfast and got talking with a man named Eamon.
We're in the Stormont Estate and we're looking along Prince of Wales Avenue towards Parliament Buildings itself, and just at the roundabout in front is a statue of Edward Carson.
Now, Edward Carson, what does he mean to yourself?
My preference would be that there wasn't a statue of Edward Carson there. It's probably a reminder of partition and parts of the problems that Ireland and Northern Ireland has had over the past 100 years or so. My preference would be that Edward Carson wasn't there.
I'm sure there are plenty of people, if they could topple that statue like the way they toppled Saddam Hussein in Iraq, they would do it.
What's clear from prior commentary is that Edward Carson is a hugely divisive figure in Irish history. As touched on earlier, the major reason why many Irish nationalists view Carson in an extremely negative light is that he's considered a primary architect of the partition of Ireland into two separate political units, one ruled by Belfast and the other by Dublin. This documentary aims to investigate some of the complexities behind Edward Carson, a proud Dublin man who from 1911 onwards galvanised Ulster Unionists against Home Rule, and in so doing became the Dubliner who divided Ireland.
Edward Carson is a Dublin barrister, and he becomes the leading speaker against Home Rule, and he galvanises the Unionists.
The Unionist leader is a Dubliner.
He's a Dubliner?
Carson is not somebody who begins political life in favour of dividing Ireland.
When he saw that Home Rule couldn't be prevented for nationalist Ireland, he had fallen back on a position of wanting exclusion of Ulster.
Partition, it's a compromise and it's brought about by Unionist opposition.
Edward Carson, he was the main architect of partition for Ireland.
He would be considered as the man who divided Ireland.
A lot of people always resented partition, as they still do. I mean, partition is still a sore issue with a lot of people.
And to begin to understand who Edward Carson was, first we need to investigate his roots. He was born in Dublin City in 1854. Historian Rob Goodbody of the Historical Committee of the Religious Society of Friends in Ireland.
Carson was born in a reasonably well-established family in Dublin in Harcourt Street. His father was an architect, and so from that kind of background, he was bound to go into some profession or another, and law was the profession that he chose.
However, before entering law, the young Carson was first educated at Arlington House School in County Laois, and then Wesley College, Dublin. Afterwards, he graduated with a law degree from Trinity College, Dublin, and then subsequently qualified as a barrister. From 1877 onwards, he quickly gained a reputation as a fearsome advocate in law courts throughout the land.
He became very successful as a barrister. Very, very successful. So Carson's career was up and up as a well sought after and successful barrister.
A very high profile barrister, and he was a heavy hitter.
He was a feared advocate, very capable in debate and sought after by the legal system.
A formidable opponent and someone you would not like to be up against.
Indeed, Carson was so formidable and successful as a barrister that in 1893 he went to work in the law courts in London. Shortly afterwards, in 1895, he had one of his most famous cases when he defended the Marquess of Queensberry against the writer Oscar Wilde's action for criminal libel. Rob Goodbody.
He took the case for the Marquess of Queensberry in defence of Wilde's libel accusation against Queensberry, and it's frequently thought that he was the one who won the case for the Marquess of Queensberry, or, to put it another way, ensured that Oscar Wilde lost his case.
It was the trial of Oscar Wilde that really brought that name, Carson, out in the open, and of course it was widely publicised in all the major newspapers of the day.
County Tyrone historian Jonathan Gray.
And one of the things came out of the trial was the ruthless way with which Edward Carson conducted the trial and
the cross-examination.
Absolutely. And that destroyed Wilde. And I mean, his working in that trial became almost legendary.
Carson, he became high profile from that point of view, and his success there led to other cases that he was asked to do. So his career just went up and up from there.
So much so that Carson was appointed Solicitor General for England in 1900. By then he'd also become a Liberal Unionist MP in the House of Commons. A few years later, in 1910, Carson became leader of the Irish Unionist Parliamentary Party. Now, after the general elections of 1910, the Irish Parliamentary Party, led by Carson's political rival John Redmond, held the balance of power in British politics and used that power to compel the ruling Liberal government to make Irish Home Rule a reality. Edward Carson was deeply opposed to Home Rule because he believed it would inevitably loosen and finally break the political union between Ireland and Great Britain. In order to bolster the Unionist cause, in 1911 Carson accepted an invitation to visit Ulster. Rob Goodbody.
His career as a Unionist politician really took a new level when Craig invited him up to Ulster to address a meeting at Craigavon in 1911. And at that meeting, he won the hearts of Unionist Ulster. And from that point, he effectively could do no wrong.
The Craigavon demonstration was the first of many mass meetings in which Edward Carson mobilised Ulster Unionists to fight Home Rule as a unified political force. Historian James Scannell of the Bray-Coolin Historical Society.
He galvanised the Unionists, brought them together, and he gave these great speeches and mass gatherings, and he became the leader of the Unionist cause against Home Rule and everything it stood for. And his basic opposition was they were being taken out of the Union, and that was the whole problem. If they were taken out of the Union with the Dublin Parliament, they might be taken out totally later on, because they saw Home Rule as just a stepping stone to independence, and he was sharp enough to realise that.
And as James Scannell just touched on, Carson was able to fire up his Unionist audiences with his spellbinding speeches. Belfast local historian Wendy Hood.
Carson, he said that the Home Rule Bill was the most nefarious conspiracy ever hatched against a free people. Those are the sort of words that really get you boiling if you don't want to be going one place, and you get determined.
His skills as an orator enabled him to get the hearts of the Unionists in mass meetings in the north and effectively made him the spokesperson for Irish Unionism.
Historian Rob Goodbody. Here's Dr. Cormac Moore, historian in residence for Dublin City Council and also the author of the book Birth of the Border, The Impact of Partition in Ireland.
Carson was very effective at opposition, and there was very few people who were able to match his brilliance in actually fighting a cause, using whatever language he can, rallying people behind him. Like, he gave huge rallies in Ulster and in England as well, and Scotland in this cause, and he got a lot of support.
It's just a capable way of vocalising, and people were very much drawn to him. We've seen those types of carries right throughout Irish history, haven't we? People who, one end of the people call them rabble rousers, other folks call them great leaders, depends on your point of view. But he certainly was a man who could inspire leadership.
Irish history enthusiast Ivan McKeown. Here is Dr. Martin O'Donoghue, lecturer in modern British and Irish history at the University of Sheffield.
Carson, if we look at the years 1912 to 14, he's very, very effective as a platform speaker, as a parliamentary speaker, as a propagandist, and he's really crucial to what is a very, very effective propaganda and popular campaign against Home Rule among Unionists. He's somebody who takes a lead role. He's very good at rallying crowds. He's very good at getting Unionist supporters on their feet. And he's somebody who's able to mobilise them, and also is somebody that they see can take the fight to the government and indeed to Redmond and the Irish Party as well.
Carson, with his unbelievable abilities as an orator, did a huge amount to make Unionists feel that they were a unified political body with unified political thoughts.
Edward Carson commanded tremendous respect among the people because he came across as someone who was genuine, he was serious.
Billy Dixon. And although Carson commanded much respect from Ulster Unionists, nevertheless he wasn't afraid to whip up his audiences and play to their worst fears. Ronan McGreevy, journalist and also the author of the book Wherever the Firing Line Extends, Ireland and the Western Front.
Well, Carson understood the fears of Unionists very well, Southern Unionists as well as Northern ones, and he was very effective at mobilising the fears that Unionists had at the time.
So what exactly were the fears of Ulster Unionists at the time? James Scannell.
They had a fear that were going to be excluded from the imperial market. Vis-a-vis that the industrial base of Ireland was Northern Ireland, and they saw that if Ireland goes independent, eventually we won't get into the markets. There'll be an imaginary border put between us and Britain, and that would mean tariffs and duties, because that's how things were done at that stage. Protectionism, and they saw themselves being excluded from that market, so therefore they were very worried, because they were basically, that was the business, that was the industrial base of the country, so they were not happy with this idea that they could be excluded from the big imperial market, British market, and the worldwide market as well.
Their attitude was, if Ireland gets, if you like, its independence, well, we're outnumbered. It's not even up for argument. We're outnumbered heavily in terms of voting. The outworkings of that will be a complete turnaround. We'll lose our influence. They probably did have fears about where the Catholic Church, what role it would play in any new Ireland.
Jonathan Gray of the Collegial and Clonanese Historical Society, based in County Tyrone. Here's historian Brendan Holland, also a member of the Collegial and Clonanese Historical Society.
The whole attitude of the Covenanters was simply stated in the slogan that was typical of the time. Home rule is Rome rule. And that, in effect, it manifested the insecurity that the Protestant population in the northern part of the island would have felt had there been home rule for the whole island. So that's what Carson tapped into, was that fear.
Did Carson actually believe it? Did he think that this was the way it was going to play out, or was he just politicking?
It's really difficult to know what was in his mind. I'm not too sure that he would have, but certainly the northern people would have believed it because they felt distinctly threatened by the power of the Catholic Church.
And that was something that the Unionist campaign centred on, that home rule was Rome rule.
There's no doubt that the Protestant majority, the Rome rule thing was big in their head. And in those days, to be fair to them, there was a lot of influence from the Roman Catholic Church in Ireland. So you can imagine that they would have really thought it would have threatened their Protestant heritage, with people that minded so terribly about that sort of thing.
Belfast local historian Wendy Hood. So were Ulster Unionist fears justified? Brendan Holland once again.
But looking at it, as neutral as one can from the outside, it's understandable that they felt threatened by home rule, and they would have felt that eventually they would be subsumed into this great Roman Catholic state. Subsequent events after partition sort of nearly proved them right, to a certain extent. Now, I say that as a Northern Catholic.
From 1912 to 1914, Edward Carson spearheaded a supercharged Ulster Unionist campaign to prevent home rule. Now, one of the highlights of this campaign was Ulster Day, which was held on the 28th of September 1912. Ulster Day involved most of the adult Unionists in Ulster signing a covenant or public declaration, officially called the Ulster Solemn League and Covenant, to resist home rule by all means necessary. The first person to sign the covenant was Edward Carson. Dermot Malady, historian and also the author of a 2-volume biography of the Irish parliamentary leader John Redmond.
Well, in September 1912, 250,000 men signed the Solemn League and Covenant, and roughly the same number of women signed an equivalent document. I'm not quite sure why they couldn't all sign the same document, but effectively anyway, 500,000 of the 1 million strong, the 500,000 adults basically, which was just about every adult, maybe 80 to 90% of all Unionist adults in the northeast of the island signed the Solemn League and Covenant, which was a pledge to resist with every means at their disposal any attempt to bring, they called it a conspiracy, to bring in home rule for Ireland. So that pledge, whether one likes it or not, it has to be seen as a great democratic expression of opinion. There's no denying the fact that it expressed popular opposition on the part of the Unionist community.
Declarations were signed all over the place: Australia, Canada, New Zealand, India, everywhere. It's not just an Irish thing. There are Unionists everywhere, and they signed the declaration, and these are sent in. And of course, there's the famous picture in City Hall, the table with the Union Jack on it, and Carson goes in and signs his name. And so that they're making clear to the British government that they're going to stand up and fight.
And he's flanked by Craig and Lord Londonderry.
All the top notches there, So he makes it quite clear that they're going to stand up and fight.
James Scannell. So just how much of a game changer was the Ulster Covenant? Jonathan Gray.
Massive. I mean, as people who are involved in history, I mean, I will still go and look at the Covenant signatures online in Prony. You can actually see the pages with the signatures of ancestors or people that you've asked to research their family. I mean, they went from everywhere to their local signing office. They signed even in the workhouses. It crossed social barriers. They were so sure this was the right thing to do.
Unionist opposition, the Ulster Solemn League and Covenant, it's opposition that's very, very organised by Unionists across Ulster.
You had people signing the Ulster Covenant in blood, ordinary people.
500,000 of them signed the Ulster Covenant. They didn't do so with a gun to their backs. They did so because they wanted to do it.
The Ulster Covenant, which is signed, and that's an indication that Ulster is right and Ulster will fight. So there is a great tension in the country building up.
Well, they were seriously fired up. They really felt that this was the beginning of a winning streak almost.
Wendy Hood. Here's Rob Goodbody.
Vast numbers of people signed this covenant, and it was primarily to give a message to the government that this is not just words, that the people of Unionist Ulster are totally behind this in vast numbers and you cannot ignore us. That was the message.
So did the message get through to the Liberal government of the day? Dermot Milady.
The Liberal government more or less ignored the Solemn League and Covenant, and most Liberal politicians took the attitude that they were just going to have to suck it up because they were a minority on the island of Ireland, and the parliamentary majority at Westminster had, well, at that stage it hadn't actually passed the legislation, but there was a majority in favour, and the Liberal attitude was that they were not going to oppose the will of the majority on the island of Ireland, so they certainly were not going to humour the wishes of the 500,000 Unionist people who had signed the Covenant. When that happened, the Unionist leaders had to escalate their campaign a stage further.
And such escalation involved Carson formally establishing a military organisation called the Ulster Volunteer Force, or UVF, in early 1913 to oppose Home Rule by armed resistance.
In January 1913, UVF units all over Northern Ireland, what's now Northern Ireland, began drilling, and they began receiving training from retired army officers, and then they began to import weapons. And the rhetoric of the Unionists was then that if we have to, we'll line the ditches to resist Home Rule.
By the end of 1913, the UVF had more than 90,000 members. Now, if things weren't bad enough in Ireland, in March 1914 they got a lot worse, when the majority of British Army officers based in the current military camp threatened to resign or accept dismissal, rather than obey orders to conduct military operations against the UVF. Martin O'Donoghue.
And then when we have the incident at the Curragh, where officers resign rather than say that they would take up arms against the Ulster Volunteers, this ratcheting up of tensions and as Ireland teeters towards civil war, in some eyes, can be seen back to the formation of the Ulster Volunteers. But at the same time, I guess, it's also the case that I think Carson's not the only one who's driving the resort to arms.
Indeed, Carson was ably assisted in his policy of armed resistance by the likes of Fred Crawford, the UVF's Director of Ordnance. In early 1914, Carson sanctioned Crawford's secret mission to import arms from Germany for the UVF. The net result being, in April 1914, almost 25,000 guns and between 3 to 5 million rounds of ammunition were landed into Ulster, in what became known as the Larne gun running. Cormac Moore.
Edward Carson was the person who met with Fred Crawford, who led those gun runnings, told him to go to Germany to get weapons. So Carson plays a pivotal role in all of this, in actually arming Ulster. So he can't get away from it or substitute the responsibility to someone else. He was the leader and he called for the arming of Ulster units.
Carson, he was responsible with a number of others for introducing the gun to Irish politics.
Edward Carson reintroduced the gun back into Irish politics.
Carson, whether he intended to go the whole way and bring about armed conflict, he had effectively opened a Pandora's box.
Historian Rob Goodbody of the Historical Committee of the Religious Society of Friends in Ireland.
And one of the effects of this was in 1914, Irish nationalists, realising there was a very strong possibility of the Unionists in Ulster starting an armed struggle and attacking perhaps nationalists in the north, that belatedly the nationalists to start to arm themselves. And the fact that both sides were now armed was heading towards a civil war in Ireland.
The Ulster Volunteer Force is better armed than the Irish National Volunteers because they have a lot more hardware and they are determined to fight.
James Scannell. Here's military historian John Goodman.
You know, Ireland was a tinderbox. We were heading for some form of civil war. With two groups of 100,000 plus men being armed, it was only going to go in one direction. It was just a matter of when.
Civil war becomes a real possibility. And Carson is very culpable in all of this.
So how did British politicians, in particular those in the Liberal government, react to the extremely combustible situation in Ireland? Dr. Martin O'Donoghue of the University of Sheffield.
For a long, long time, the Redmondites said that the Ulster Volunteers were bluffing, but during these years of crisis, Carson and the Ulster Volunteers did enough to convince certainly British politicians that they weren't bluffing.
And inevitably such British politicians began negotiating with all parties to the Irish crisis to find a possible solution. Now it was at this juncture that the contentious issue of partition took centre stage. By at least 1913, Edward Carson, realising that Home Rule couldn't be prevented, began to support the permanent exclusion of 6 counties of Ulster from Home Rule. Carson's stance on the partition of 6 Ulster counties from the rest of Ireland had evolved during the Home Rule crisis from 1912 onwards, from a tactic to a compromise. Partition was no longer the means to try block Home Rule for all of Ireland, but was instead an actual end in itself. Dr. Cormac Moore, author of the book Birth of the Border, The Impact of Partition in Ireland.
Edward Carson, from 1913, he was firmly stuck 6 county permanent exclusion. He never ever wavered from that. Even under huge opposition from Protestants and Unionists within the other 3 counties of Ulster, Monaghan, Cavan and Donegal, he never wavered from the permanent exclusion of that. So this is, I believe, a key to what Carson believed in. He believed in the permanent exclusion of the 6 counties of Ulster. He believed in partition by 1913 as an end in itself. And we cannot escape from that fact by his actions and by his words.
So why did Carson specifically choose 6 Ulster counties only, as opposed to all 9 of the historic counties of Ulster? Dr. Martin O'Donoghue.
There were always arguments that a 9-county Ulster, the majority in favour of the Union in the 9 counties, was small. It could be chipped away over time. So it could become a situation where within a few years, a majority in the 9 counties actually would want to join a Home Rule Ireland. There was an argument that 4 counties was so small as that would be unviable. So 6 counties was perceived, at least, to be large enough to be viable, but although Fermanagh and Tyrone had narrow nationalist majorities, it would still be a very, very stable Unionist majority. And as we know, of course, after 1921, the Unionist Party were in perpetual government because the basic arithmetic meant that nationalists, although they abstained very often, even if they didn't abstain, they were never going to secure a working majority to form a government in Northern Ireland. So those considerations were taken into account by Carson.
By July 1914, King George V initiated the Buckingham Palace Conference to try resolve the crisis in Ireland. Historian Dermot Milledy.
King George V was also getting very worried about the prospect of an outbreak of violence on the island, and he called a conference in July of 1914 at Buckingham Palace, and he brought together Redmond and Dillon on one side, Carson and Bunner Law on the other side, and his own liberal input, of course. And they sat around in Buckingham Palace for 3 days. They studied maps of Ulster, and they tried to find ways in which Ulster could be excluded from Home Rule with the minimum amount of injustice to either side.
The focus was largely on Fermanagh and Tyrone as to whether they should be in or should be out.
So they talked and talked around it for 3 days and couldn't reach agreement, and the conference broke up with great regret on all sides. Then, now remember, in retrospect, this conference broke up on the 24th of July. A major world event was about to happen, which of course they didn't know about, but in 10 days from then, the world was going to be at war.
And on the 4th of August 1914, Britain declared war with Germany. And because Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, it was also officially at war. Edward Carson reacted to the outbreak of war by agreeing a compromise with the British government, whereby the Home Rule Bill was enacted, but its operation suspended until the end of the war, on the understanding that Ulster's exclusion would then be reconsidered. Also, Carson called on UVF members to enlist and fight for Britain. James Scannell.
Carson, he believes demonstration loyalty guarantees no home rule. So the Ulster Volunteer Force, they enlist in the British Army and they form the Ulster Division. They're brought together as one unit.
Similar to Edward Carson, the Irish nationalist leader John Redmond urged pro-Home Rule members of the Irish Volunteer Force to join the British war effort. Both sets of volunteers, the UVF and the Irish Volunteers, ended up dying in their thousands in the war. In addition, the war brought Carson to the heart of power in British politics. At various stages during the war, he was Attorney General, First Lord of the Admiralty, as well as a member of the government's War Cabinet. In contrast, John Redmond took no cabinet post. Dr. Martin O'Donoghue.
Pre-September 1914, there's a Liberal Party in government relying on the Nationalists to stay in power. And then by 1915, you have a coalition government, you have Liberals and Conservatives in government, and you have an Irish Unionist like Carson at the cabinet table, and no nationalist voice. So the musical chairs of British politics have changed very dramatically at that point, that the Nationalist Party really doesn't have the sway that it had before the war by then. And Redmond, in some ways, that might be a situation where he was damned if he did and damned if he didn't. But the upshot of the situation is that Carson's at the cabinet table and he is not.
Carson, once he's in the war cabinet, he's in with people, so he's able to discuss and enunciate and argue. And you can be sure that at times he argued the view why there should be no home rule for Ireland.
Historian James Scannell of the Brakehulen Historical Society. And whatever about Carson's advocacy work against Home Rule among the halls of power in London, the Home Rule cause was unexpectedly dealt a huge blow in April 1916, when the Easter Rising erupted in Dublin, with much of the city centre destroyed and hundreds of people killed. Now, many constitutional nationalists held Edward Carson to be partially culpable, since, they argued, he was the one who'd helped to bring the gun back into Irish politics. Dermot Milledy.
Constitutional nationalists, even as they condemned the action of the rebels in 1916, they would say, well, this all began, the introduction of violence into Irish politics, this all began with Carson. He's the one who started it. He brought the gun into Irish politics. He started threatening that if Home Rule was imposed on Ulster, there'd be violence on the streets, and they had to avoid that, you know. So Carson was seen as the bête noire of Irish nationalism.
In the wake of the 1916 Easter Rising, the British government initiated yet more talks in July 1916 to try bring Home Rule for Ireland into operation. Not only did the talks fail, but they also doomed the cause of Home Rule, since John Redmond conceded the principle of partition, but without getting anything in return. So how did Carson react to the failed talks? James Scannell.
Carson is delighted in the sense that the Home Rule Act hasn't come in. So that's gone. And it's gone by the wayside at that stage. The 1916 July conference, he knows the British government will probably give him partition. He served in the cabinet, the war cabinet, and Carson sort of demonstrates his loyalty. So eventually, when the issue comes to the boil to deal with the Irish question, the Home Rule Act is abandoned, and they said you get the new Government of Ireland Act of 1920, and that provides for the establishment of Northern Ireland and gives a devolved government to 6 counties of Northern Ireland. And of course that makes its first sitting then in June 21.
In 1921, just before the truce, King George came over to Belfast to open the new Northern Ireland Parliament. Now, nationalist opinion was full of mockery and contempt for this tin pot parliament, and they called it all kinds of names: toy parliament, tin pot parliament. They were predicting that it would last maybe a week or two and would collapse, and so on and so on. But they even were calling the new 6-county territory of the Northern Ireland Parliament in 1921. They were referring to that as Carsonia, the new state of Carsonia. And this kind of humour, mocking humour, was a kind of a compensation for their feeling of impotence, that they hadn't managed to prevent this. You know, for all the talk of condemning partition, it had gone ahead, and now here was the king using conciliatory language, but there he was opening the new parliament.
Dermot Malidi. However, the birth of a self-governing Northern Ireland with its own devolved parliament within the United Kingdom was accompanied by much sectarian violence and horrendous loss of life. The violence started in earnest in July 1920 and lasted about 2 years. Now, many historians contended Edward Carson's incendiary speeches at the time were a contributory factor to the outbreak of that violence, which led to the so-called Belfast pogroms. Journalist and historian Ronan McGreevy.
Edward Carson is somebody, I believe, who bears a lot of responsibility for the pogroms in Belfast in 1920 and 21.
Why is that?
Because he made a speech on the 12th of July 1920 saying that we need to root Sinn Féin out of the north, and I don't like words, I like deeds with action. After that, there was this was in advance of the shipyard expulsions from Belfast, the targeting of Catholic workers, the targeting of rotten prods.
It was a period of intense violence, terrible atrocities.
The horror that was happening at the time was unreal. The pogroms around the city and beyond. Women and children were being murdered, you know, just shot in the head, bombs thrown into kids playing on the streets.
Carson. He's sometimes been held responsible, that his speech helped encourage that. But it must be pointed out, it was already a very volatile situation. Between January 1920 and July, something like 40 policemen had been killed by the IRA. There were IRA attacks on police stations in Crossgar and other parts of Down in July. Sinn Féin had done well at the elections. There had been riots in Derry. So the whole situation was deteriorating, and this was all part of the picture.
Brian Walker, Professor Emeritus of Irish Studies at Queen's University, Belfast. Here's Dr. Cormac Moore.
When we look at the communal violence in Belfast in 1920-1922, Carson's leader when it starts off, and he definitely adds to it by his inflammatory language, particularly his speech at Finnehy in July 1920. But he is leaving the stage. He's not there as much, you know. And by 1921, he's effectively gone from Ulster. James Craig has taken over from him as leader of the Ulster Unionist Party. And the worst part of that violence was the first half of 1922. You know, by far more people were killed or wounded in 1922. And Carson, it has to be said, has left the stage by then. So, you know, he's not as culpable for all of the violence that happens as he may have been at the start. So, you know, I think we do have to put that into context as well.
What's clear from prior commentary is that Edward Carson's words helped to exacerbate sectarian tensions in Ulster. So was Carson himself sectarian? Dr. Mary Harris, former senior lecturer in history at NUI, Galway.
I think his concern was very much on maintaining the connection within the empire. And he wasn't generally a sectarian person. And he, at one point in the late 19th century, for example, he supported a demand by the Home Rule Party for a Catholic university. And later on, he was known to attend Catholic funerals, something that Orange men weren't supposed to do. He, of course, attended John Redmond's funeral in 1918. So in that sense, he didn't play as much on religious matters as many of the other Unionists did.
After the Northern Ireland Parliament had been secured, Edward Carson politely declined the invitation to be the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland in 1921, leaving that job to James Craig. Also in 1921, Carson resigned his leadership of the Ulster Unionist Council, the ruling body for Ulster Unionists. So how did his subsequent career go? Martin O'Donoghue.
Carson takes a back seat really once he retires from public life. He sits in the House of Lords. He's very critical of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, but he really takes a back seat, and Craig becomes the first Prime Minister. Carson is honoured in Northern Ireland. His statue stands in front of Stormont, but he really retires from public life.
Edward Carson died in the year 1935 and was given a state funeral and buried in St Anne's Cathedral in Belfast. Now, although Carson was laid to rest in Belfast, nevertheless, as was mentioned earlier in this documentary, he was born and reared in Dublin City. However, unlike the majority of his fellow Dubliners, his politics was unionist and not nationalist, and throughout his life he fervently desired for all of Ireland to remain within the Union. However, when he realised that this was no longer a realistic option, he committed himself wholeheartedly to the exclusion of the North East from Home Rule, which eventually resulted in the partition of Ireland in the early 1920s. The two key people behind partition were Edward Carson and James Craig. Historian Cormac Moore.
Even though Craig played a key role in the background, the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party at the time of partition was Edward Carson, the man who led that campaign against Home Rule and who led the campaign of permanent exclusion of 6 counties, which ultimately led to the creation of Northern Ireland, was Edward Carson. So even though he said a lot of contradictory things, and even though he said to friends, I have no country anymore, he was the main architect of partition for Ireland.
Carson, he was the man who divided Ireland, but I think without him Ireland would have divided anyway, because the divisions were there from way before Carson was involved.
Historian Rob Goodbody.
The divisions were there when Gladstone and Parnell were trying to get Home Rule through, and they had not become any less divisive by the time that Redmond and Carson were in there negotiating for or against Home Rule. So, yes, he was the architect of the division, but he was not the instigator of it, if that makes sense. The division was already there, but he was the one largely responsible for the form that division took in the end.
He certainly is the man who gave it the form.
Dr. Mary Harris.
Partition may be seen as his greatest legacy, but also it has to be seen as his own greatest failure, because that most definitely wasn't what he wanted. Carson's dream was to maintain all of the island of Ireland within the British Empire.
Carson, partition of Ireland, that's his ultimate legacy, and we're all living with the consequences of that to this day.
What about the accusation that he was also, you get it from the other side of the argument, that, he was the guy who saved Ulster for the Union, so to speak?
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's certainly true from their point of view. I mean, there's two diametrically different views of history here. One is the fact that, he did save Ulster Unionism. From that respect, he was a hero. But, with the other nationalist Ireland, he's not a hero. So, partition was something that suited the Northern Ireland polity that was set up then.
Ronan McGreevy. Here's County Tyrone historian Brendan Holland.
At the end of the day, I suppose the biggest losers in the whole thing, the biggest losers in the whole 1912, 1914, 1921 settlement were the Catholics in the north. The Southerners were busy after they had their disagreement in the Civil War and rebuilding the country. They hadn't time to devote to looking after their countrymen in the north. They became sort of forgotten, and they were in such a huge minority here that basically the Unionists felt they could do what they wanted with them because they saw them as a threat.
Edward Carson, he was the main architect of partition for Ireland.
I don't think partition was good for Ireland in general, right? I mean, you know, we always think about partition and its legacy in terms of what happened in the 6 counties, but actually for the 26 counties as well, it left what I regard as a confessional Catholic sectarian state on this side of the border as well. So it wasn't good for either side of Ireland.
Edward Carson, a very divisive figure.
He would be considered as the man who divided Ireland.
A lot of people always resented partition, as they still do. I mean, partition is still a sore issue with a lot of people.
Funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.